Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. May 2nd, 1986. Three experienced spelunkers gathered at the entrance to Goliath's cave in southeastern Minnesota with a plan that seemed perfectly reasonable. Greg Heidemann, Mike Lilia, and Jim Magnuson were part of an ambitious project to open up access to this maze cave system that had been drawing significant interest from the caving community in recent years. Goliath's cave was both fascinating and frustrating. The maze of passages included a significant stream that made exploration challenging and unpredictable. The main entrance was a brutal 200-foot crawl, around 61 meters, that flooded regularly throughout the year, creating an impassable sump that locked cave explorers out of the system. For much of the year, the cave was completely inaccessible. The caving community had been working on a solution. They wanted to establish a second entrance to bypass the flooding problem entirely. To help coordinate a dig from the outside, they needed to survey the dig site. But first, they had to get past the flooded entrance that was blocking all access. In mid-March, the entrance sumped completely, sealing the cave behind a barrier of water. The community needed a pump powerful enough to handle the high rate of stream flow. They chose a gasoline-powered pump, reasoning that the cave had good ventilation from a side passage when the entrance was sumped. It seemed like a practical solution to a practical problem. The plan was methodical and well thought out. The entrance wasn't just one sump. It was actually two separate sumps divided by 15 feet, 4.57 meters, of passage. The team decided to pump the first sump on Friday night, let the air clear overnight, then pump the second sump on Saturday morning. After that, they would conduct their survey. It was a careful, staged approach that showed respect for the dangers involved. On Friday evening at 8:30 p.m., the three members arrived at the cave entrance ready to execute their plan. They carried the gasoline pump through the darkness to the edge of the first sump. The cave was drawing a good breeze that flowed into the main part of the cave past the sump via a side passage that was too tight for human passage but perfect for air circulation. The ventilation seemed adequate for their purposes. Heidemann and Lilia set up the pump about 20 feet, 6.1 meters, from the water's edge near Sump 1. They attached the intake hose with practiced efficiency, started the pump, and primed it. The engine roared to life in the confined space. The smell of gasoline exhaust immediately began filling the passage. They estimated the sump held no more than 3,000 gallons and should pump out in about 15 minutes. It seemed like a quick operation. Get in, pump out the water, and get out. But caves have a way of making simple operations deadly. After starting the pump, they noticed the output hose had kinked. Water wasn't flowing properly. Heidemann and Lilia moved to untangle the hose, positioning themselves at a spot that was receiving fresh air from ahead of the junction with the side passage. They were being careful, staying in the areas with good ventilation while they worked. Before exiting the cave, they wanted to verify that the pump was running properly. Lilia volunteered to crawl back and check on the pump. It was a simple task that should have taken just a minute or two. The pump had now been running for about 10 minutes in what had become relatively stagnant air. The side passage was drawing air into the main cave, but that meant the exhaust fumes from the gasoline engine were being concentrated in the entrance crawl. Carbon monoxide, the invisible killer produced by gasoline engines, was building up to lethal levels. Carbon monoxide is insidious because it gives almost no warning before it kills. It's colorless, odorless, and tasteless. The early symptoms, headache, dizziness, confusion, are subtle and easy to dismiss as fatigue or stress. By the time victims realize something is wrong, their blood is already saturated with the poison, and their judgment is impaired. Heidemann waited at the junction with fresh air, counting to 15 before looking around the corner to check on Lilia. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lilia was squatting by the water's edge near the pump, moving strangely. Something was clearly wrong. Heidemann crawled toward Lilia, while Lilia began crawling back toward him. The fact that Lilia was moving under his own power was reassuring, but Heidemann's instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. He reached the pump and immediately shut it down, cutting off the source of the deadly fumes. He asked Lilia if he was okay. Lilia replied yes, but added that they should leave because he had a headache. Those words should have triggered immediate alarm bells. A headache in a confined space with a running gasoline engine means one thing: carbon monoxide poisoning. But before either of them could process this information fully, Lilia fell to his knees. The situation went from concerning to critical in seconds. Heidemann had already killed the pump completely, but the damage was already done. The air in the entrance crawl was saturated with carbon monoxide. Every breath they took was bringing more poison into their bloodstreams. Heidemann shook Lilia and insisted they leave immediately. They needed to get to fresh air before the carbon monoxide overwhelmed them both. Lilia's response was terrifying in its simplicity. "I can't make it." In that moment, Heidemann felt the poison hit him too. He was suddenly and nearly overcome by the same effects that had dropped Lilia. The carbon monoxide was shutting down his body's ability to transport oxygen. His muscles were failing. His brain was becoming foggy. Death was reaching out for both of them. It was approximately 11:15 p.m. Heidemann made a futile attempt to drag Lilia toward the entrance, but his strength was gone. He could barely move himself, let alone drag another person. He was faced with a horrible choice: stay and die with his friend, or save himself and hope he could get help in time. Heidemann chose survival. He abandoned Lilia and concentrated every ounce of his remaining strength on crawling to the entrance. The whole time he had an overwhelming desire to stop and rest. His body was screaming at him to just lie down and close his eyes. But some primal survival instinct kept him moving. He did not stop. Not even once. 15 minutes after leaving Lilia, Heidemann reached Magnusson at their camp on the surface. He was in bad shape, barely coherent, but adamant about one thing. He refused to go back into the cave. He pleaded with Magnusson not to go in either. He had just experienced something so terrifying that every fiber of his being rejected the idea of returning to that poison passage. Magnusson faced an impossible situation. His friend was dying in the cave, but he couldn't get Lilia out alone. He needed help, and he needed it fast. He jumped in his vehicle and drove to the house of Steve Landsteiner, the closest caving expert in the area. Every minute counted now. Landsteiner grabbed an oxygen tank from a welding rig and raced back with Magnusson. At 11:58 p.m., they left the oxygen tank at the sinkhole entrance and crawled into the cave. The pump had been off for about 45 minutes, but there was no telling how much carbon monoxide remained in the passage. When they reached Lilia at 12:14 a.m., the scene was nightmarish. He was lying face down in the water, still breathing, but very shallowly. They could hear the wet, gurgling sound that indicated water in his lungs. He had collapsed into the sump and had been lying there for nearly an hour, slowly drowning while unconscious from carbon monoxide poisoning. Landsteiner immediately exited to retrieve the oxygen tank. He got Heidemann, who had recovered enough to help, and they carried the heavy cylinder back through the entrance crawl. They held the output hose over Lilia's nose and mouth, forcing pure oxygen into his lungs. But moving him was going to be a major operation. They exited again to construct a makeshift drag stretcher from a tarp and poles. Time was slipping away. Lilia had been unconscious in the cave for over an hour. His body temperature was dropping. The water in his lungs was threatening to drown him, even as the carbon monoxide continued to poison his blood. At approximately 12:50 a.m., they returned with the tarp and poles and began the agonizing process of dragging Lilia's unconscious body through the long entrance crawl. Every inch of progress required tremendous effort. Finally, at about 1:45 a.m., they dragged him out of the cave entrance. But they weren't done yet. The cave entrance was at the bottom of a 40-foot, around 12.2 meters, sinkhole. They needed more manpower to get him up the climb. At 2:25 a.m., they returned with enough people to haul Lilia's body up the vertical section and onto level ground. They rushed him to the emergency room at the hospital in Cresco, Iowa. The medical staff was shocked by his condition. His body temperature was 81 degrees, severe hypothermia that indicated he had been lying in cold water for an extended period. He had water in his lungs from aspirating while unconscious. Most critically, his blood oxygen count was dangerously low from the carbon monoxide poisoning. The hospital staff worked frantically to stabilize him, but they lacked the equipment needed for this level of emergency. Without a respirator, they were unable to increase his oxygen level to safe ranges. The carbon monoxide had bonded to his red blood cells, preventing them from carrying oxygen. His body was slowly suffocating from the inside. The decision was made to fly Lilia via emergency helicopter to the Mayo Clinic, which had the specialized equipment and expertise needed to treat severe carbon monoxide poisoning. The helicopter lifted off into the night sky, racing against time to save a man who just had some time left. At the Mayo Clinic, Lilia finally received the treatment he desperately needed. Slowly, painfully, he recovered. He had survived an ordeal that should have killed him multiple times over. In his incident report, Magnuson offered brutal hindsight criticism of their decisions. First, they had overlooked the value of having local cave experts and manpower available on short notice. Second, in serious cases like this, professional medical aid should be sought immediately despite concerns about bad publicity. Third, and most importantly, never use gas engine equipment in a cave under any circumstances. But Magnuson also acknowledged that his decision to return immediately without calling extensively for outside aid had probably saved Lilia's life. If he had spent time organizing a large rescue effort, Lilia would have died in that crawl. September 22nd, 1984. The Georgia Nature Conservancy had organized what they thought would be a fun, educational trip into Pettyjohn's Cave on Pigeon Mountain. The goal was simple and well-intentioned. Show Conservancy members that caves are exciting places worth protecting. 28 enthusiastic Conservancy members gathered at the cave entrance, ready for adventure. 5 experienced spelunkers were brought along to guide them through the underground passages. But good intentions don't prevent disasters. The trip was doomed from the start by decisions made long before anyone set foot in the cave. The planning was amateur at best, catastrophic at worst. The organizers provided hard hats, which seemed responsible, but those helmets had no chin straps. The lights were handheld flashlights instead of helmet-mounted lamps. Most critically, 5 experienced ones were supposed to supervise 28 novices, a ratio of nearly 6 beginners to every experienced person. The physical condition of the group ranged from poor to good, which should have been another red flag. Caving is physically demanding. It requires strength, flexibility, and endurance. Taking people in poor physical condition into a challenging cave system was asking for trouble. But the organizers pressed forward with their plan, confident that enthusiasm would overcome inexperience. The group was divided into 2 teams of 14 novices each. Both groups would follow the same route through Pettyjohn's Cave, into the big room, down to the flat room, through the notorious Z-bends, back through the flats, up into the big room, and out. About 2,000 feet of traverse through tight passages, steep climbs, and challenging terrain. For experienced members, this was a moderate trip. For complete novices in poor physical condition with inadequate equipment, it was a recipe for disaster. The expedition started with the kind of forced enthusiasm that marks doomed ventures. The Conservancy members were excited, chattering and laughing as they entered the cave mouth. The senior members tried to manage the chaos, but 5 people cannot effectively supervise 28 beginners in a dark, confusing cave environment. The group quickly became spread out and disorganized. The cave itself was unforgiving. The passages alternated between spacious chambers and tight crawls that forced even experienced cave explorers to squeeze through on their bellies. The rock was slippery in places, sharp in others. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, making surfaces treacherous. Every step required attention and care, qualities that excited novices rarely possess. Before the first group even reached the Z-bends, the reality of cave exploration had already shattered the illusions of 4 Conservancy members. They had discovered that caves were not fun at all. They were cold, dark, claustrophobic, and exhausting. These 4 people had to be escorted back to the surface, pulling experienced ones away from supervising the rest of the group. Bill Franks was among those who had decided caves were definitely not his idea of a good time. Chuck House was escorting him up from the flat room to the big room, navigating the steep incline that connected the 2 chambers. This was one of the more challenging sections of the cave. a slope that required careful footwork and attention to handholds. Franks was tired, scared, and eager to get out of the cave. His attention was focused on the exit rather than on his immediate surroundings. He made a careless step, his foot slipping on wet rock. In an instant, he was falling. The 6-foot drop was bad enough, but when he hit the slope, momentum took over. He rolled 15 feet down the incline, his body bouncing off rocks and picking up speed. The hard hat that was supposed to protect him flew off his head immediately. Without a chin strap to secure it, the helmet was useless the moment he started falling. Franks's unprotected head struck a rock with a sickening crack that echoed through the chamber. Blood immediately began flowing from a scalp laceration. Chuck Howe scrambled down the slope to reach the injured man, his heart pounding. Head injuries in caves are nightmare scenarios. Without immediate access to medical care, even minor head trauma can become life-threatening. House quickly assessed Franks for serious injuries, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of skull fracture or brain damage. Fortunately, the injury appeared to be relatively minor, just a small scalp cut that was bleeding heavily, as scalp wounds tend to do. House applied pressure to stop the bleeding and helped Franks to his feet. Despite the scary fall and the blood, Franks was able to walk out of the cave under his own power. The first accident of the day had resulted in nothing worse than a bad scare and some stitches. But the day's disasters were far from over. The second group, led by experienced member Alan Paget, had cleared the challenging Z-bends and was heading up into the big room. They were making good progress despite the inexperience of the group members. Paget was doing his best to manage 14 novices simultaneously, an impossible task that required him to be in multiple places at once. Robert Boone was having a particularly difficult time. He was a large man, and the tight crawls had been a serious challenge for him. Every squeeze through narrow passages had been a claustrophobic struggle. Every climb had taxed his strength and endurance. He was exhausted, frustrated, and probably questioning why he had ever agreed to this trip. As Boone climbed the slope leading up into the big room, fatigue and poor technique combined into catastrophe. His foot slipped. His hands failed to find purchase on the slick rock. He fell hard, and just like Bill Franks before him, his hard hat flew off immediately. The useless helmet bounced away down the slope as Boone's body followed. At the bottom of the slope, Boone landed hard on a cluster of rocks. His unprotected head struck stone with tremendous force. The impact was far worse than Franks's fall had been. Boone's body went limp immediately, collapsing onto the rocks like a puppet with cut strings. Alan Paget witnessed the fall with horror. He descended immediately, scrambling down the slope with his heart in his throat. When he reached Boone, the situation was as bad as he had feared. The man was completely unconscious. Blood was flowing freely from a scalp laceration. Most terrifying of all, Boone's breathing was labored and irregular, a sign of serious head trauma. Paget's training kicked in automatically. He rolled Boone onto his back and cleared his airway, removing any obstruction that might be interfering with breathing. The man's breathing eased slightly, becoming more regular. Paget applied pressure to the scalp wound, trying to slow the bleeding. He checked his watch. 3:56 p.m. Every second counted now. One member was sent racing through the cave to fetch a first aid kit. Another was dispatched to the surface to start organizing a full rescue effort. This was no longer a fun conservancy outing. It was a medical emergency deep underground. Paget stayed with Boone, monitoring his breathing and trying to keep him stable. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Boone regained consciousness. His eyes opened, confused and unfocused. The bleeding from his scalp wound was brought under control with continued pressure. Paget and the others carefully moved him to a smoother spot and began trying to prevent hypothermia, a serious risk for an injured person lying on the cold cave rock. They placed extra clothing underneath Boone and covered him with a space blanket. Someone constructed an improvised warming tent using a garbage bag and a candle, creating a small pocket of warm air around the injured man. These were basic wilderness first aid techniques, but in a cave, they were critical for keeping someone alive. Boone was conscious, but clearly not well. He could remember his name when asked, but he had no idea what the date was. A classic sign of head trauma and possible concussion. He complained that his hands were going to sleep, suggesting nerve issues. More ominously, he reported pain in his back. Paget knew that back pain after a fall could indicate spinal injury, which made moving the victim incredibly dangerous. When the first aid kit finally arrived, they properly dressed the head wound and continued to monitor Boone's condition. The remaining Conservancy group members were quietly escorted out of the cave. What had started as a fun educational trip had turned into a grim evacuation operation. Meanwhile, on the surface, rescue personnel had been contacted and were mobilizing. Professional cave rescue in 1984 was a serious operation requiring specialized equipment and trained personnel. A crew of 18 rescuers entered the cave, carrying a sked stretcher, a specialized flexible stretcher designed for cave rescues. Getting Boone out of the cave was a complex technical operation. The sked stretcher had to be carefully maneuvered through tight passages and up steep slopes. At the climb-up section, rescuers rigged a haul system using ropes and pulleys to lift the stretcher and its precious cargo. Every movement had to be careful and controlled to avoid aggravating Boone's injuries. The rescue took hours. Boone was finally carried out of Pettyjohn's cave and placed in an ambulance at 7:30 p.m., nearly 4 hours after his initial fall. Medical examination revealed the full extent of his injuries: scalp laceration, various contusions, and most seriously, a cracked vertebra in his spine. The back pain he had complained about was a fractured bone in his spinal column. Alan Paget, in his incident report, was blunt about what had gone wrong. The trip had suffered from catastrophically poor planning. Helmets without chin straps were worse than useless. They created a false sense of security while providing no actual protection. Handheld lights meant spelunkers couldn't keep both hands free for climbing. The ratio of experienced ones to novices was completely inadequate. Paget suggested that trips like this required helmets with chin straps, helmet-mounted lights, and one experienced person for every 3 or 4 novices at most. These weren't radical suggestions. They were basic safety requirements that any competent trip organizer should have known. The Georgia Nature Conservancy's trip had violated every principle of safe cave exploration. Most ironically, Paget himself had been the victim of someone else's bad planning. He had done everything right during the crisis, providing excellent first aid and coordinating the rescue effort. But he never should have been put in that position. The Conservancy organizers had created a dangerous situation and then expected experienced cavers to manage the inevitable disasters.